toilet, around the seal, around the sinks and the faucets underneath. One of its most well-known species, and this is the kind that we would run into the most here in Ottawa in particular, would be the black mold. And the thing is with black mold is that it's extremely toxigenic. The other type of mold that we would find is it's a Mesophilic mold, and it requires slightly less moisture. It grows in average conditions. One of the things with Mesophilic mold is that you could find it, particularly anywhere, soil, food, and it's a type of mold that we would encounter more often outside, where the levels of humidity and moisture are regulated by its natural course. There are three other forms, and these are particularly rare, especially here in Canada. Well, the first one is zero tolerant. It grows in drier conditions. And the other one is xerophilic, which is exceptionally rare, which you would find in an arid environment like a desert or a place where it's extremely dry without any type of moisture whatsoever. So there are different types of molds. Now, inside of each of those categories, of those four categories that we're dealing with, there are hundreds of different subspecies. And so we're looking at again, it's okay, well now that we discovered that it's this type of mold, it's a hydrophilic mold, well what specific species are we dealing with? So again, that's why doing proper tests or getting proper tests done to determine exactly what you're dealing with will help to ensure that it doesn't come back and that the time and effort and money and energy put into it will be well spent. When we're dealing with mold exposure, people who are exposed to mold, there are three different ways, in particular, that humans can come into contact with it. The first one, obviously, is coming into direct contact with it. So that would be normal contact. You would touch it by mistake, or you would try to wash it, it gets on your hands, and so on and so forth. The other one is inhalation. We were talking earlier about the woman who was discovered with mold in her lungs. Well, that happened as a result of inhaling a high concentration of mold spores. And the other one is ingestion. So, eating moldy bread, for example, or if you have a child in the basement and he's running around and there's mold that's not dealt with, anything like kids, put their hands in anything, put their hands right in their mouth without a second thought. And depending on what type of mold it is, that can be very, very dangerous.
What's dermal? What does that mean?
Dermal means of the skin, so direct skin contact. So some common allergenic symptoms include, well, from mild. So we're talking, when we get into exposure, but one of those three ways: skin contact, inhalation, or ingestion. We could have, rashes, itchy, watery eyes, or we could, start getting into more severe itchiness and difficulty with breathing. And when it gets to severe, and this is, where we would find people who are particularly have immunocompromised systems, elderly, the young, people who are going through chemotherapy, for example. This is where the severe part would really come into play. Swelling, difficulty breathing, or swallowing, abdominal. We're talking some serious nasty stuff here, right? Mental confusion, dizziness, and it can really become dangerous. The other thing too with mold or contact with high levels of mold is it can actually become fatal. And that's what we want to try to avoid. And so there are different, when we get into the actual biological process, we would consider the first part superficial, which is the most common. So skin infections, nail infections, athlete's foot, which is as a form of fungi, of course. And then you've got the other kind, which is more serious. It occurs when infection gets under the skin. So if you have a cut, for example, and you come into contact with mold or a mold spore, it doesn't need to be in direct contact with the slimy, gross substance itself. It could be the mold spore in the air that comes into contact with an open wound, gets under there. The other kind is occurs when mold starts to attack the internal vital parts of your body, such as the kidneys, lungs, other organs. This is where it can become life-threatening. So we always like to paint a grim picture before we start getting into the solutions, and I'm sorry that you guys are just 8 and we're talking about systemic failure here. How's that for you? That's in direct contact. This was taken here in Ottawa, actually. This is in direct contact with black mold. So this person, as you can tell, it started off like this, and then it started to merge off into this. And the reason was that it started to grow, started to scratch and itch, and it grew out, and we discovered that the person also had an allergy to shellfish, which again just worsened things off. Now this is just one example of, thanks Andrea, this is one example of black mold and its potential problems with regards to our health. Now could you imagine if that happened to one of our children? I would lose my mind. Like I would just go completely bonkers, but this is the type of problem that we're dealing with if we don't rectify it immediately. So this is a form of mold. It's called Aspergillus, and it's common in indoor and outdoor environments. It may cause infections, allergic reactions. It could also attack our lungs, and our internal organs, as we mentioned earlier. And the type of color that this type of mold represents depends on its various species. Just right before I got into this, I said that in each mold category there are hundreds of different subspecies. Well, these ones are the common ones that we would find in our area in Ottawa. We brought the presentation down to what we would be dealing with on a regular basis. So Aspergillus is one form of mold. So if we were to find this type of mold in someone's home or in their office, then we would approach it as though we're dealing with a specific form of bacteria. We like to think of ourselves as doctors in a way where we need to accurately diagnose what the problems and the symptoms are and go right to the source. Penicillium is another form of mold. It's very common. We find this one in basements and crawl spaces the most. It's almost identical to the previous kind. It's almost identical in its texture, in its substance, and even in its color, where initially it's white in color, and we usually see this type of mold in soil, where it starts to grow. It's white right off the bat, and then it starts switching into this gross blue-green kind of pinkish stuff, and it's very difficult to determine at first what type of mold we're dealing with until we have a proper test. And it does produce mycotoxins, which again are different forms of toxigenic properties that will affect a person's system, one person to the next differently. And so for one person who may be more susceptible to these types of toxins, the reactions will be fairly severe. This is the most common kind. This is the one that we would find most often. And actually we used to bring, and I was going to bring them today, these little teddy bears, if you will. And it described or looked like what the mold would be. And the black mold teddy bear, if you will, is the cutest thing you'll ever see in your life. It looks like a little plant. And under a microscope, if you guys were to go to Google and Google black mold under a microscope, you would see exactly what it would look like. And it's very interesting. But the problem with that is that it doesn't look like that at all on the surface. On the surface, it's gross, it's black, it's slimy, it's commonly found all around, especially in basements and against the walls. And when most people, when they encounter black stuff on the walls, they automatically go, it's black mold, right? And that's not necessarily true all the time. The thing is with black mold is that it really needs to be tested in order to be determined what it is, because we're dealing with something that's very toxigenic and very problematic to one's health. Now here's a picture of a house completely saturated with black mold.
What?
Now as you can tell, right, in this home, it's still furnished. So that means the person was living in these conditions for a period of time. So we could see that the mold grew rapidly from the walls, spread to the roof, and as you can tell over here, it started to spread onto the fabrics of the couch. One of the things with black mold in particular, thank you Andre, is that the surface, that black slimy surface, starts to dry up really quickly. And when it dries up, picture those leaves again that we were talking about at the beginning. And what happens when a gust of wind or anyone walks by, those mold spores get thrown across the room, they come into contact with another dark, dingy, moist environment, and it spreads, like you can see here. Now this is a pretty extreme case, I'm not gonna lie, but it's not an uncommon case. How's everyone's stomach feeling so far? Now there's a relationship between indoor mold and increased symptoms such as eye, nose, and throat irritation, coughing, shortness of breath, asthma, and allergic reactions. And one of the things that we've been discovering with the most is that in offices, people have been complaining about the air they're breathing is not healthy. It's not up to standard because they are experiencing all these different types of health problems. And part of it could be mold, and part of it could be other pollutants in the air. And what's required in order to properly determine that is an air quality test. So who's at risk for mold exposure? Well, we're all at risk, but the people who would suffer or get damaged the most, people with, again, compromised immune systems. So people, for example, I mentioned this earlier, who are undergoing forms of chemotherapy, for example, or who are at different stages of cancer, infants, elderly people, people who are asthmatic by nature. These are the people who are the most at risk for those really serious health problems. Lung failure, kidney failure, and even fatalities. So when I look at this for myself, these are the people that I care for the most in my life. My grandmother, children, and my uncle, for example, who's at home going through regular chemotherapy. And so I'm always concerned on one level whenever I walk in and I smell something right away, and I don't know if it's mold, but my mind plays tricks on me, tells me that it is. Because what we're dealing with is a substance that could seriously hurt and harm someone. So what is IAQ? What is indoor air quality? Well, it's the quality of air in or around the buildings and structures. Now, in hospitals, for example, they have the best, or laboratories, hospitals and laboratories, they have the best indoor air quality. Now, how to, best measure air quality is through a particulate count. So we would count the amount of particles that are in the air. We have a special device that does that, and actually right before we started, we pulled it out and decided to count the particle count here in this room. Surprisingly, it's not that bad. So in a hospital or a laboratory, surprisingly, it's not that bad. But in a hospital or laboratory, the particle count is 0. So that means that it's, perfect. There's no pollutants in the air. Now the average home, or the average particle count, which we consider healthy, is 250,000 particles in the air. So when we put this on here, do you guys want to know the count?
Yeah.
555,000, which is really good. It's only a little bit more than half what we would consider normal, but considering the amount of space, food, amount of people, that's a pretty good count. So you guys are breathing in some pretty good quality air, I must say. And what we want to do with indoor air quality is we need to determine, first of all, how healthy is it, how dangerous the air might be, and part of how we do that is be able to calculate the amount of particles in the air. On Tuesday, I believe, we went to Montreal into a home to do a mold assessment. And we did all of our tests, and one of the tests that we decided to do was a particle count. Inside the home, in this apartment, the particle count was at 143 million, which is insane. So it's, we're talking in here, in this large room with this amount of people, a particle count of 550,000, and then in the other one, we're talking up in the millions. So there was definitely something wrong, and this again was the elderly woman that we described that had difficulties with her health whenever she was in her apartment. Well, we wonder why. If there's a particle count that high, then there's something in the air that's causing those problems. Now, did you know that we as Canadians, we spend over 90% of our time inside? Which is why it's important that we need to ensure that in our homes, in our offices, that our air quality is good. Since we're spending all this time inside and we're breathing in all the time, it's imperative that we have healthy, clean air. So why is it important? Well, poor indoor air quality can worsen symptoms related to asthma and allergies. It could also be linked to sick building syndrome. How many people have heard of sick building syndrome before? Excellent. And it's a combination of symptoms thought to be caused by the environment in which a person works or lives in.